everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to leave no dye behind and dye some yarn using some leftover acid dyes that are mixed with some citric acid crystals. I used these dyes when I was creating a sweater quantities worth of yarn in a previous episode of Dyepot Weekly. And so I don't remember the exact colors that we have, but we certainly have an orange, a green, and a black, and I thought that we would use these heavily all over some yarn to create some beautiful fall colorways. Now, I did store these dyes in some plastic cups and then covered it with tin foil just to keep it from spilling. Acid, which includes citric acid powder, can cause damage to aluminum over time. You can see that, I don't know if it's dissolving or just somehow it's degrading the aluminum. So I'll look and see if this is brittle. Maybe it's been 2 months max, I think, since I stored these. Certainly not that long. Yeah, let's get set up. So here on my stovetop, I have a full-size catering steam pan that is 4 inches deep. I like to have this extra depth just in case we need it. And today we are gonna dye 200 grams of Swish DK yarn. This yarn is 100% superwash merino, and I pre-soaked it in just some plain tap water for a couple of hours. Now, our dyes are mixed with citric acid. There's no acid in here yet. Let's do something a little different, and let's add some water but no acid to the yarn. I'm now adding 6 cups of tap water here, and my hypothesis is that we will see potentially some of the first colors might spread a little more, and then as we get more and more acid in here, we might see less spread of colors. Of course, I'm not really doing this officially as an experiment, mainly because I plan to flip and move and we're just gonna have fun and dye the yarn. I just turned the heat on to start heating this up. I think in terms of acidity, 1 tablespoon of citric acid powder is 12 times as acidic as a tablespoon of white vinegar. So you need a lot less citric acid to get your dye bath to the same pH as you would vinegar, because the vinegar is already a mixed solution, and so there's already dilution there and whatnot. So yeah, we'll see if we make any preliminary observations from this, if things end up feeling like they're behaving differently from what I might normally expect if I had had some vinegar in here. But yeah, and then depending on what we see, we might decide to design some side-by-side comparisons of starting with and without acid already in the pan. But we are heating up, so I am going to go get protected with my respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, which I will always be wearing while we are using dry dye powder. I don't see any pitting here on the tin foil, at least at this stage, which is honestly, I don't think things have been together that long. But what I will show you in a moment is just how much powder we have. And the answer is a lot. I would say between the 3 colors, we have probably 2 tablespoons of citric acid. If I can find from the original video how much citric acid powder I've started with for each of the colors, I will update on the screen right now. But I feel like, especially with the orange and the green, there's not a lot of dye in there. I think there's a lot more in the black, because I wanted, when I added these on before, I wanted to be able to sort of spread them out. And right now, I'm going ham, I'm going heavy, I'm acting like I'm making like a sugar cookie with sprinkles. And what's funny is where they are a little lighter, you really can't see very much yet. At least with regards to the orange. The green may spread more. I went really heavy with the orange to start. I'm going a little bit lighter with the green. I should reduce the heat to low. Because if it gets steamy, as it gets steamy, my fingers get a little bit more moist. And then it becomes a little harder to sprinkle and speckle. But I'm actually pretty amazed how well these are layering so far. I would say things aren't striking quite as quickly as they, we have a fair amount of water in here, but I am seeing some good speckles, but I'm also seeing some spread. So, yeah, I mean, at this stage, though, from the amount I've added, we now have a lot of acid in here. And then with our black, yeah, I think that the black is more potent than the other colors. Now, one thing I would do is if I'm going to do, like, starting with no acid, and then the only acid come in with the dyes, if I was going to do that, I would probably start with, say, like, Stroll fingering weight yarn versus Swish DK, just because it would be, speckles tend to strike a little faster since there's a little bit more twist there than there is in Swish. Swish is a bit loftier. And so this is actually really, really fun, very fall. I'm seeing some spread, but again, that could be with the amount of liquid. I really like where this is going. Unfortunately, I don't have a yarn mop on hand, which I sort of regret. I am gonna go get one. All right, I have a skein of Knit Cook's Hawthorne fingering weight yarn, which I just quickly dunked in some water with no acid. And I will use this to wipe my gloves off once they have dye on them, so we leave no dye behind a second time. But if we look here, the orange speckles are still present, but they're a bit softer, and I think there's a tiny bit more spread. Actually, scratch that. They're spread with all the colors. The black speckles are just the most dramatic. Definitely dramatic. I mean, if we zoom in, you can see that there's orange speckles with the spread and same with green. So it's just the black has the most contrast, so that stands out the most. I really like where this colorway is going. I am a tad nervous that when I flip, well, things seem to have struck. I was a little nervous that it might soften too much once I flip. But, you know, the coverage also is pretty shallow, so there's plenty of space to add a lot more color. And I don't mind if things end up turning brown. That is something I am more than okay with. But I am going heavy with our orange, and I'm going to go heavy with the green. The black I'm using a little bit more restraint just because I don't want it to overwhelm things, and I like the contrast of the black speckles over the base. So unlike some other videos where I might go for heavy speckles, again, we're getting some orange and green speckles, but there's some spots where I'm adding it a wee bit heavy to really feel like speckles, like you almost feel like we have larger splotches of color in here. The good news is that the colors seem to be striking really quickly. I mean, with this amount of citric acid powder, like, it's all of a sudden, like, we had so much acid that we've added already that I don't think it mattered that we didn't start with any. Of course, if you want to prevent spread, I would absolutely start out with, I would make sure you start out with a lot of acid, or at least a good amount of acid in your dye pot. I'm not sure I've made a dent in with this yet. I do think, now I'm coming in with the black, that I will probably do at least 2 more flips. I think I'll open this up inside out and see what we have there. I don't mind if we have some white left behind, but what I don't want is like a large patch where you feel like you have inches that's only white. But the other thing that sometimes I forget is sometimes you might have dye and like the speckles might be on one side of the strand and then not on the other at all. So it's important to keep that in mind. But the more citric acid that you mix your dyes in, the more powder you will need to add to get as much pigment. And I think that for that sweater video, since I wanted the speckles to be really light, I mean, I'm adding a ton of powder right now. There's not a lot of dye in here because that allowed me to spread the speckles much further when that's what I was going for. So I'm rather enjoying this, even if I have a ton of dye left. And of course, at this stage I go to the yarn mop and there's like no color on my hands. But previously there was a lot more, so that's just funny. I will, if I end up with something I love here, which so far I'm really, really liking it, I don't really want to wait. There's some pigment, but like the speckles are staying put. I like what's going on with this colorway right now, and so I want to keep that feeling going and moving forward. And I don't want to lose that magic, but ooh, I may not need to do a million flips of this. But so that means that I'm going to have a lot of dye left over. And so on that last Hawthorne, there I can decide, okay, we aren't going to leave anything left. Let's go for it, if that makes sense. So I am attempting to expose yarn where I feel like I want more coverage. There will likely be at least one more flip. But now let's speed things up. There really weren't that many regions that needed more dye left. But what was really striking me as I was lifting the yarn and moving it was how soft the orange really became throughout the colorway. It felt brighter, much brighter, and felt like it had more impact. But as I moved the yarn and added more color, the green and the black stood out more. All of this makes this a really stunning fall colorway, and it has a lovely softness to it. But I did realize as I added the rest of the color to this DK weight yarn that I have so much black, orange, and green left behind. I waited a couple minutes after adding the rest of the powder and then poured on some water that did have white vinegar in it. This is a leftover dye bath that I used in another video from another project, and I figured that I would use this to completely submerge the yarn, and so that way I could heat set it on the other side of the stove for 30 minutes to make sure everything is really well set. In my second steam pan, I added some of that same water with vinegar that was left over from another project, and then brought over the yarn mop, that skein of Hawthorne that really only had a tiny patches of sort of a brownish black orange color from wiping my fingers when I was dyeing the previous skeins. However, on the skein of Hawthorne, I am going to use up all these dyes. I did realize as I was speckling on the powder using my fingertips that this is finally the circumstance, and this is the type of project where having a salt shaker would work really, really well for me, because there is so little pigment in there and so much more citric acid that having that salt shaker would get a similar coverage to what I'm doing here with my fingers, because I'm adding on the dye really, really heavily. Normally, I say I prefer to use my fingers because I can let a few crystals fall out at a time. But when it comes to dumping more powder, it would be a lot easier to have the shakers to sort of shake and distribute the powder onto the yarn. So that is something that I should write down and plan to revisit trying that again, because I think that if I'm using a proportion that is more dye heavy, using the salt shaker wouldn't result in the type of speckles that I want to see. But if there's enough extra powder in there, it would. So that's something I should give a shot. But anyway, I used up the rest of this dye on this lovely skein of Hawthorne, and then added more water and turned up the heat to let this set for an additional 20 to 30 minutes. Once I got near the end of each of the different color sections, I was rinsing my hand in some of the leftover water that I had off to the side. And at the end, I did rinse the rest of the dye I had in there. So then I poured on this sort of diluted black mixture, which will add more of a gray all over the yarn. And I can say that you might not see on camera yet, but you can still really see these speckles, and it's cool. I'm bringing the temp right up, and things are a bit overexposed, which means that the picture is lighter on the camera than it is in person. But you very much can see those speckles even with the base. And I think that is a lot more like what I see in person. Now I've reduced the exposure a lot to show. So these speckles I think are gonna be really subtle, and I'm super excited. I love how this colorway is turning out. But now you can see the difference of our first batch and this one. It's a lot deeper. I'm gonna set a new timer for 30 minutes. I'm gonna go ahead and let everything heat for 30 minutes. Then I'm gonna turn off the heat, let both pans cool completely, and then we can go and wash the yarn. But I'll check back in if there's anything else notable. We almost have a situation where I am disappointed that these are not on the same base, because this gray, this deeper gray with the pops of green and little hints of orange looks so good with the other stains. So good. I just added some dish soap so we can wash it. But oh man, the water was clear, by the way, on all the dye baths, and we've got, look at those speckles. Oh man, I see a little bit of something in the water. So let's do another round of rinsing and see where we are. I can always rinse them separately if needed, but I'm not seeing anything else come out. Oh, those speckles are so good. And I mean, even that one, it looks almost solid, but the speckles are so subtle and pretty. Oh, I love having leftover powders. But anyway, I'm gonna finish rinsing out the soap. Then I'm gonna put the yarn through my spin dryer to remove the excess water, hang it up to dry, and we can look at the finished dry yarn. All of the yarn that we dyed here is a lot of fun, but I want to take a closer look at the finished skein, because from right here, it just looks very gray. But as you look closer, you can really see the more orange and green undertones in here, which I love. That extra dimension this gives to this more subtle speckled gray yarn. I think it is so pretty, and I kind of want to play with like heavy black speckles and other colors and get other little undertones. I think that would be really fun. I would be hard pressed to say what the background color of this yarn is. Like, part of me is like, ooh, it's a little bit like peach orange, and part of it is a little bit green and a little bit gray, which really, it's probably variegated a bit all three, but with the contrast with the speckles, it is harder to say what the base color really is there. The orange speckles do not show up as sharp as the black and the green. The orange is absolutely present, but the black and green definitely have more visual impact, especially when you are farther away. But even farther away, you still see the orange, and so you can see and appreciate it. And these are both like lovely fall skeins of yarn. As happy as I am with the dark gray speckled colorway, I am glad that I decided to stop where I did with the orange, black, and green speckles, because I really like that softer, well, it's not softer, that paler colorway as well. And so this is another great excuse to talk about how sometimes when you're leaving dye behind and you want to use up all those leftover colors, if you hit a point that you really, really love, it's okay to stop. And this is something I need to remind myself of too, because sometimes I'm so motivated to try to use things up that I have that I will push going even though I maybe liked where things were at an earlier stage. And so both are okay. Both, it's okay to try to just use everything up because I enjoy that deep one, but I like the lighter ones as well. And the only regret that I have is that I wish I had done the deeper colorway on the same base, so that way it would be easier to incorporate them in the same project. Not that it's impossible to use a fingering weight yarn with a DK weight yarn in a project. There are definitely ways that you could do that. Especially, I mean, you could hold the fingering weight one double, I suppose, and that would work really well. Even so, the twists and things are very different, and so these are harder ones to mix together. Although actually, I do have a knitting project that I'm hoping to cast on sometime in 2021 that involves 3 drastically different, but all DK weight yarn bases for a shawl for myself. So that is something that I know I need to play around with more with myself. But anyway, I digress. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you love this video and if you like the more free-flowing, less planned type dyeing that is part of this Leave No Dye Behind bonus series, which comes from the fact that I just really can't leave any dye behind. Subscribe, turn on notifications, give thumbs up and leave comments below. Engaging with videos is the best way to help support this YouTube channel. Of course, I do have an Etsy shop and a Patreon. Links to everything are down below. You can go and check that out there. But, ooh, I mean, to be fair, these 3 colors were Speckles used on one project. So as far as leftovers go, this isn't a tough color combination to combine. But I am thinking about trying to do another color challenge for myself at some point. So, oh man, I really like the heavy layered speckles. I'll probably need to do that when I do a color challenge again. Interesting. But anyway, it's time to sign off. So thank you so much for watching.